So welcome once again. This is the day when I like to remember that whatever people believe dogmatically about the details of the life of Jesus Christ, or the meaning of, or in fact, the literalness of the crucifixion and resurrection, that there is a power in the sense of just all the millions of people all over the world right now that are somehow drawn to open their minds and hearts to a greater mystery. And so it doesn't matter in a very real sense what we believe literally about it. We, of course, in Unity want to use this, as we always do, as a metaphysical lesson and try to learn from it and apply it practically to our own lives. But that doesn't mean that everybody else is wrong. Everybody finds their own right path. So I thought then today, the temptation, of course, for me with my endless teaching and talking about ideas, it's a very strong temptation this morning, having gone through now the 7 weeks of Lent and worked so intensely on understanding the creative process through which ideas manifest, in the sense that most of you have been working on some sort of a creative project during this time. The temptation for me is to sort of try to recap the whole thing this morning and make sure that everybody remembers everything, right? Well, I'm going to resist that temptation, thankfully, and try to stick to one thing this morning, and that one thing has to do with this mystery of oneness. You may recall, to go from the sublime to the ridiculous here, if you ever saw the movie City Slickers, you remember the character, Billy Crystal, of course, was the city slicker, and this crusty old character actor named Curly, who is this most impressive cowboy you've ever seen in your life. And these city slickers were so impressed with Curly that they began to believe that he was some sort of a divine being. He was so impressive. And at the end of the movie, you recall, Curly dies. And before he dies, the city slickers are begging him, "Please, Curly, tell us, what is the mystery of life? What makes you so great? Tell us what it is. Please, tell us." And Curly, as you recall, goes with his dying gasp, "One thing." And that's it. And they're all going, and they're shaking him and going, "What's the one thing, Curly? What's the one thing? What is it? What's the one thing?" And of course, the lesson is, that is the lesson. One thing. The simplicity, as we call it in Unity, beyond the complexity. One thing. In the life of Curly, it was that he loved being a cowboy so much that he had become the world's perfect cowboy. And it shone through, and it impressed other people. This was just an example. He became a Christ-like example of cowboydom, if you can call it that, okay? Now, the question then is, what is the one thing? So after all these 7 weeks now of thinking and talking about and working on the complexity of the creative process, going through the steps and the stages of creation, from the first to the second to the third to the fourth to the fifth to the sixth, and today the seventh step, which, as we just meditated upon, is a different kind of work. It's a different kind of work. And the secret to it is one thing. Let go and let God. But if you had not gone through the complexity of confronting the elements of your own consciousness, then this would be simply another platitude or another cliche. And for the people who take it on that level, they're left shaking the dying Curly and screaming, "Tell us what the one thing is." Whereas those of you who have truly confronted the creative process, including the resistance that naturally arises here in the material world, when you set out to do anything, and have learned to some degree at least how to not react to it, and how to not be discouraged by it, and how to not fight it, and how instead to use the resistance that we encounter in the material world as a way of transcending the complications of consciousness entangled in its own effects, which is Mr. Fillmore, the founder of Unity's favorite definition of evil, consciousness entangled in its own effects. So this one thing is about rising above that, about finding a way of being and a way of seeing that has nothing to do with doing. And this is, of course, the paradox that has been much more clearly talked about and speculated upon in some of the Eastern religions historically than in Christianity. But this, of course, is the metaphysical side of Christianity. And so ultimately you get to this great mystery of oneness. It has, as I said, nothing to do with doing. But if you had not done anything, then there would be no way of experiencing it. That's part of the paradox of, you see, the traditional Christian dogmatic argument about faith versus works, for example. Both are true. If you had not done and made the effort to do something, to take responsibility for your own life, to change, to honestly confront the selves within you that are egocentric and that cause your problems, because that kind of commitment, not commitment to running around and trying to change other people or sell yourself or exploit or anything like that, but the commitment to go within yourself and go through and confront the complexity, including the dark side within yourself, and to get down to something that is really you, as Curly said, one thing. But that one thing needs to be the real you. That's the message in a nutshell, metaphysically, of the life and the passion of Jesus Christ. And that's what the crucifixion and the resurrection symbolically represents. So, in that sense then, today, I'm going to try to stick to just sort of this concept of it's a simple thing that now we want to shift to. And this week, this entire week, the way we're approaching this in Unity, the metaphysical approach to the creative process, this Sunday, or seventh step in the creative process, is not just one day of resurrection. This is the first day of the Sabbath week of the resurrection. And I say this because it would be nice if you could somehow set aside or create some space in your life this week to try to sort of allow that to happen or to unfold in one way or another. It's not easy. Many people have to go back to work, but a lot of people at least have one more day off, Monday, Easter Monday. And if you can, try to do something this week to sort of set it aside and cooperate with this resurrection energy, because this entire week now, starting this morning, is the time Christ is risen indeed, and it takes a while to perceive it in your life, see? So I would suggest this morning as we begin to think of ways this week to sort of shelter yourself a little bit and create a Sabbath week now in the memory of the idea of resurrection and see what might unfold this week. That's why I don't want to go back into too many details about the creative process today, because now is the time to more or less stand still and open your mind and heart to the possibility that Spirit had something even greater in mind than what you thought you were working on. And in my experience, folks, that's usually the realization that comes when people really call this process a success. It's usually experienced as something like, well, it finally came, usually in the week after Easter, after they'd already given up, and it was something I could not have imagined, and it was so much better than what I was hoping and working on to create in my life that it's almost unbelievable. It's a miracle. It's a true miracle, see? Now that's the kind of receptivity that's necessary, but that means doing some things with our consciousness to make it possible. So this is not a week of doing, it's a week of being in a certain way, as we're going to talk about in a moment, and particularly being in relation to time, because time is part of this big mystery. And one of the main aspects of the resurrection concept as an idea is the time and eternity element. It is when time enters eternity, see, or the opposite, when eternity enters time. There is no such thing in the spiritual realm as what we call time here on earth, see? And so the resurrection, the awakening to eternal life, which is one aspect of it, you don't have to win in the traditional Christian dogmatic sense of salvation schemes. You don't need to win eternal life. You already have it. You already had it when you got here. What you have to do now is wake up to it, become conscious of eternal life. And that has to do with the mystery and the paradox of time and eternity, see? So part of this different kind of work, this resurrection week, or the seventh day of the creative process, where we follow the guidance of God on the seventh day of creation in Genesis, where it says simply, God rested. That's all, God rested. Has to do with a way of being in which time becomes not the debtor's prison as it's typically experienced here on earth, but something else, where you find the doorway in time to eternity. And I can tell you what the name of that doorway is, but you have to find it yourself. The name of it is now. It's now. The doorway from time to eternity is the eternal, flexible, elastic now. As we sometimes say, it is the point between the stimulus and the response of all experience in life, but unfortunately, we tend to run through life and miss the important doorway to eternity, and we stay that way, sort of bottled up in the squirrel cage of time, the debtor's prison, as it's known. So part of this mystery has to do with a way of being that opens the doorway to the eternal as opposed to the limited concept of time. The other concept that has to do with, is not a way of being, but a way of seeing. And you'll find, I think, in all the Easter and resurrection literature, music, this theme is repeated over and over. You hear it in the songs we sing, that there's a way that perception can be altered. There's a way that you don't have to make things right. There's a way of seeing things right that is truly the way of overcoming the challenges. And by this, I'm talking now about really serious and what we normally call practical problems in life: illness, disease, poverty, lack, loneliness, and all the other things, lack of whatever it is. That it's not so much a matter of doing it or making it right, but it's a perception problem. And it comes down to a way of seeing. But this too is a mystical concept, like the concept of being in time and eternity. A way of seeing things right is not the simplistic thing that many people take it to be. Many people become absolutists about this and notoriously simple-minded about this, where they just go around basically and become a Pollyanna and go around and say, well, there's no problem, everything's fine, there's no problem. There are problems, folks, and if you don't have any, I'd like to talk to you, because you're the first person on this earth since Jesus Christ, then, that doesn't have any problems. So there are real problems, and they need to be healed. They need to be solved. So don't be an absolutist about this. That's called denial, being in denial of the problem, see? So all that creative process that we've been working with through Lent is about, in fact, transforming reality through transforming your consciousness, see? This is the bottom line of metaphysics. Life is consciousness. That means your life, the experiences, including your state of health, your financial well-being, your harmony and love or lack of it in your relationships, your satisfaction or dissatisfaction in your work and your career, and your lack of creativity or your creative expression, all these things are an outpicturing of consciousness. Life is consciousness. You can take that literally. You create it. The only problem is we've been unconscious of it most of the time. And so this work we've been doing throughout the Lenten season has really nothing more to do with anything than just awakening to what we've always been doing anyway. That's how your body got sick. You created it by talking negatively mostly about it, by being tired and aching and having pains and not liking your body and stuff like that. See? The same thing about money. The reason you're poor, if you're poor, and nobody here is obviously, but if you were, for those people that are, is because they've talked themselves into it through worrying, through mindlessly saying seemingly innocent things like, boy, there's just never enough to go around, you know, there's not enough, I don't know where it's going to come from, you know, there's no hope, worrying about it, that kind of thing. And so unconsciously, and then in relationships, don't even get into it, I mean, you know, the endless inner talking and complaining and judging other people. And then you're surprised when they don't like you, you know? Well, there are no secrets, you know? And so unconsciously, we've been creating these conditions all our life. So now for these 7 weeks, we've been working on becoming conscious of the creative process. That's all we're working on here, folks. And that makes it sound so simple that I think I have to go back to one of the main principles, at least to remind those people that think now they're home free, that there's a little more to it. Remember the principle we worked with back around the middle of this process that goes like this. It's a metaphysical principle. It says the simplicity that precedes the complexity is worthless. But the simplicity beyond the complexity is the pearl of great price. We talked about that in terms of some examples of, say, platitudes on the one hand, New Age platitudes, which are worthless, but that same platitude can be experienced as a simple realization once you have gone through some complexity and confronted the complexity in your own consciousness. And then that same simple thing, in other words, let's take the example we used, I think it was about addictions and about, say, in a 12-step program, if you have, somebody would say, one day at a time, easy does it. And we talked about how that, you know, you can walk into any bar and you find some drunk sitting there going, yep, one day at a time. Easy does it? Yep, let's have another drink. One day at a time, that's what I say, that's my, okay. But then you go through the whole process, and this is just one example, say a 12-step program where you actually graduate from the actual steps themselves to the principles where the power is, and the traditions, that's where the real power is in that. And you've gone through the complexity, in other words. You're no longer in it from a needy point of view. It has worked its transformation power upon you, and I think you know the difference here, people who are seriously working on that as opposed to people who are simply still struggling with the steps. And there you see that that same simple insight can save your life, because now it's the simplicity beyond the complexity. This is much more profound than you think, folks. And I'm going to give you an anecdote that I just read this week. I was reading about a new book about the life of the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung and his notorious crises that he had in life, and he had several of them. And this was an interesting one, because in one of his later crises, he had already become world famous. He was, you know, world-renowned psychologist and writer and all that. And he was entering into another crisis period. And he took a trip, it says. They say he took a trip to Africa, and he took a trip to North America, and he was in the United States, and he went and visited the Taos Indians down in what is now New Mexico. And he managed to get an appointment or a time to sit and talk to a reclusive mystic chief of the Taos Indians. And this was someone at that time who was known notoriously as someone, he would not talk to people. He would not talk particularly to white people or to Europeans. And so Carl Jung somehow impressed this guy as being a like-minded soul. And so he got a rare interview with this notoriously reclusive and mystical chief of the Taos band of Indians. And the way Carl Jung related this afterwards, it was one of those insights about the simplicity beyond the complexity, as opposed to the simplicity prior to the complexity. So he's talking to this chief, and the chief finally got to the point where he sort of trusted Dr. Young, and he was confiding in him some of his true feelings. And he said things like, we don't know what to think about these white people. We're afraid of them. We think they're mad. Look at them. And he says in very graphic terms, I won't describe it all, it's a little too graphic, but he said, look at the expressions on their faces. Look at their eyes and the way their mouth is set. They're so needy. They want something. What is it they want? We don't trust them. We think they're insane. And Carl Jung said, of course nowadays politically correct, you say, well, you can't say that. That's, a way of labeling people that's not okay, but try to get in the spirit of this. He was puzzled. He was truly puzzled as to what was wrong with these people and why they were treating his people so badly. And so Carl Jung asked him, why do you think this is? Why are white people, by then he was assuming he was one of them, why are those white people so insane? And the chief allegedly leaned over and got close to his ear as though he was whispering something that was so secret and so unbelievable that he didn't dare say it out loud. And he said to Mr. Young, they say they think with their heads. And Carl Jung goes, yes, well, how else, And the chief didn't say anything. He just went. Carl Jung said, how do you think? And he went. So, here's a simple insight that we have seen for the last several decades in every self-help book that's ever been published, and all the pop psychology that is cluttering up bookstores and TV stations and airwaves and everything else all over the world, which is you have to think from the heart, the wisdom of the heart, the blah, blah, blah. But there's a little more to it than that. And this marked a turning point, the final crisis in the life of Carl Jung, according to his autobiography. And he said, then it hit me from the power of the consciousness of the man who said it, that, this doesn't mean at all what all those overly simplistic Pollyannas have been trying to make of this thing. There really is something wrong with human consciousness that needs to be righted. And now we've talked about that during Lent in the sense of it's better to think of it as not something wrong, I think, but as something that's a natural stage in the evolution of the human consciousness here on earth. In other words, it's part of our curriculum that we entered into this life to do. And we talked about it last week in terms of rewiring your consciousness. In other words, using thinking and feeling functions for what they really are designed for, which is creating your life, see? And using your intuition, as the chief taught. That's another way of describing thinking with the heart. It doesn't mean, by the way, feeling instead of thinking. You know that, I hope. That's the simplicity before the complexity that people try to make out of it, and they mess up their lives something terrible if they do that. In other words, if they do what feels good, that's that sort of rule, see? But beyond that is the faculty of intuition, which in a sense is thinking from the heart. And that's a whole different thing than going with your feelings, or, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, the problem of trying to be rational and where that leads morally and ethically. So it is a sense, a returning or a right side, making right side up the creative functions of consciousness. Now, all that is the complexity. Beyond the complexity, the same simple truth. And that's the point of the resurrection. That now, whatever work you've done, however far you've come, whatever you think you understand or feel about this process, now it's time to put it aside and instead practice a different way of being. And just briefly, I'm going to talk about two sort of concepts or ways to experience this Sabbath week now, to experience, hopefully, in your life, and for the purpose of allowing your dream to manifest. Because this is the important thing now. It's getting out of the way that's important. We block our good. We get in the way of it. And so now the challenge this week is to get out of the way so that God or Spirit or whatever you want to call it can begin to show you tangibly, manifest what your real good consists of. And as I said earlier, it may very well be something far different and far better than what you thought you were working on. Thus, we always try to leave an opening when we make our affirmations in unity and when we're getting specific about demonstrating something. And that little tag that we put on them is very important at this stage. This or something better. So I hope that at this point, whatever you have come to as far as what your creative project is, whatever your goal or your desire, the thing that you're attempting to make or manifest in life, add one little tag line to it now for this week. This or something better. And then focus on that. Because the secret, folks, has to do quite often with simply recognizing your good when it comes. It's easier to see in some cases than others. Perhaps the realm of relationships is the easiest, and I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say this when they finally find their soulmate, so to speak, you know. All this time that I was searching, and all this work, and all the workshops I went to, all the dating services, all the this and that and the other that I went through to try to find, and then one day I looked around, and I peeked over the cubicle, and there he was, you know, or whatever, you know, something like that. And we don't recognize, I'm talking about a workplace, okay, not a bathroom. I'm talking about Dilbert, okay? I'm talking about the world of Dilbert here, okay, where a lot of people work, okay? Anyway, recognizing your good when you see it, see? So this week, a way of being in relation to time so that you have time to see it. And then a way of seeing itself. That is a way of perception. So here's just a couple things to be thinking about this week to get away from the doing and the organizing and the control issues, and instead focus not on doing, but being and seeing. In being in relation to time. There is, we like to say in unity, physical time, which is what most of us live in most of the time, and it's linear, and there's never enough of it. But there's another type of time, and we call it metaphysical time. And metaphysical time is not limited by minutes or hours. Metaphysical time is the doorway to eternity, as we talked about a few moments ago. You've all had this experience at one point or another, whether in a high state of consciousness in meditation, where it seems like that meditation, either one of two extremes, either it seems like it lasted forever, or it seems like it was only a second and really it was a long time, see? In other words, how time in the psychological sense expands and contracts. The other way that people traditionally experience this elasticity of time or metaphysical time is when you're confronted with a crisis. Notoriously, if you've ever been in a car accident or any kind of a serious life-threatening situation, people in wars and people in battle experience this all the time. When you're afraid enough, time expands dramatically. And people will say, the 3 seconds before the car crashed seemed like an eternity. It seemed like 3 hours, people will tell you, for example. Try to think back to a time in your life when that's been experienced for you, whether it was a negative experience or hopefully more pleasantly a positive experience, such as a mystical experience, as a oneness with nature and so on. This is a way now to begin to encourage this week a way of being in relation to time where you find the secret gate. We said before it's called now. Let me give you 2 examples of ways that that's experienced. The poet T.S. Eliot wrote, one of his famous lines he wrote, it was about evil. He said, between the stimulus and the response falls the shadow. And it's true as a way of describing life existentially. See? That his point was, that's where the problem comes in. between the stimulus and the response, with the best of intentions, we somehow allow negativity to creep in there. Another famous writer, Viktor Frankl, who experienced the now in a concentration camp in World War II, wrote later, he wrote, between the stimulus and the response is freedom. That's where he discovered freedom. And the famous way he described it was, all of a sudden I realized that the guards, the Nazis who were guarding us and controlling apparently our lives, were not free. That they were not free, that they were literally in bondage. And I realized, no matter what my outer circumstances were, that there is between the stimulus and the response of every experience this timeless moment called now. And becoming conscious of that is the whole secret. You could go back to Curly out on the range and say, if you want to know what the one thing is, that's it. It's the one thing. If you can cultivate the consciousness of the now and begin to live your life without being driven by stimulus response, stimulus response, stimulus response, then you will find that time takes on a whole new dimension. And that is a big part of the secret of the resurrection. I'm going to suggest this week that you take some time to practice this, whether you go out in nature or spend time in meditation or begin to feed your soul in one way or another, your thinking nature, your feeling nature, the senses, and your spiritual nature, and find ways to bring time into those dimensions of your creative being. And the other thing that has to do then with a way of seeing has to do with your vision. There is a way of seeing in which everything is okay. And that's really all that needs to be said about that. And I know you know what I mean. There is a way of seeing things. No matter what's going on in your life, no matter what the problems and challenges are, there's a way, and you've experienced it, those moments of well-being, when you're not worried, when you all of a sudden have no fears, when you get outside yourself and realize how silly all that is. Those mystical moments, this is what we want to cultivate this week, in addition to the doorway into eternity from time, those mystical moments. So begin to practice this week, seeing things in a way where everything is okay. That means not judging, not condemning, not worrying, not being fearful, but just trusting the universe, basically, is another way of describing it. When we say let go and let God, that's what the affirmation means, see? So I'm going to suggest as a way of remembering that throughout the coming week, I let go and let God is the affirmation for the week, and I'm going to suggest, as we did in week 1, way back at the beginning of Lent, where we affirmed, or at least we tried to remember to affirm, let there be light, 10,000 times or more. This week, the assignment is affirm, I let go and let God 10,000 times at least before next Sunday. And I'm serious about this. Let's close our eyes a moment and internalize and prepare ourselves now for this different kind of work. As we approach this week of Sabbath, the mystery of oneness, the resurrection, there is a way of seeing things in which everything is okay. That's what we're seeking to cultivate. And the way we describe that in affirmative form is, I let go and let God. What then does it mean to you to let go and let God? That's the question. And through affirming this statement of receptivity, that mystery will begin to reveal itself to you. Little by little, the answer will appear. In other words, the resurrection does not necessarily come all at once. It appears gradually. First, you notice the stone is rolled away. just like in the scriptures on resurrection morning. The tomb is empty. Something has changed. It doesn't feel as hopeless anymore. But what is it? The friends and disciples of Jesus run around confused and say, but what's happened? It's gone. He's gone. And then finally they realize he lives. But only then do they see him. Now the same thing is true for your demonstration, for your resurrection. Begin today and continue throughout these 7 days of this 7th week, the Sabbath. I trust the universe. I let go and let God. I trust the universe. Together, please. I trust the universe. I let go and let God. And so it is. Thank you, God, for the opportunities that come our way this week to demonstrate and realize this mystery. Through these means do we grow.